It goes without saying, 100% of people will die. It's just an unfortunate fact of existence. Sadly, we are not yet able to kill death. That being said, throughout history, people have suffered horrific deaths, and one of the worst ways to go in general, no matter what form, is torture. Today, I thought I would go over 5 of the most brutal torture methods in existence. So, without further ado, let's get into it. And by it, I don't mean a noose or perhaps a guillotine, but I mean the video itself. Keel hauling. Keel hauling was a punishment for piracy mentioned as far back as 700 AD, and images of it have been depicted on vases and in paintings. The keel is the underside of a boat. Keel hauling means to drag along the bottom of the boat. On larger ships, the condemned was tied to 2 ropes and thrown overboard. This was where he most likely suffered his first injuries, right when he hit the water. He was then pulled from one side of the ship to the other. If the ropes were left slack, he was left underwater longer and risked drowning. If the ropes were pulled taut, his body was split open by the barnacles on the bottom of the vessel. His head was also slammed repeatedly throughout his journey to the other side. When the accused was pulled out of the water on the opposite side of the ship, he was usually hanged above the water as an additional punishment, as well as a warning to others who might disobey the captain. If the captain decided that the punishment hadn't been severe enough, the poor sailor might be sent back under the boat to the side from which he originated. If the punishment was dealt out on a smaller or less barnacled vessel, the damned man was dragged from the front of the boat to the back. Oftentimes, keel hauling resulted in the death or mauling of the victim. If he survived the ordeal, his cuts were likely to get infected. At the very least, he was left with some gnarly scars. In more severe cases, the barnacles might tear off a man's arm or even decapitate him. Keel hauling was an official punishment of the Dutch Navy until 1853. In these cases, an oil-soaked sponge was put in the condemned man's mouth so that he could take 1 extra breath underwater. The punishment was outlawed by the British Navy in 1720. It was banned in France and the Netherlands in 1750. There are reports of keel hauling still being practiced on Egyptian ships until the late 1800s. Abacination. Abacination means to cause extreme damage to the eyeballs, resulting in blindness. This can be done by pulling the eyeball out, poking the eyeball with something sharp or hot, or removing the eyelids and forcing the victim to stare at the sun. Once removed, burning coals could be put into the eye sockets, burning the person alive from the inside out. In ancient Persia, a device was developed that strapped 2 cup-shaped pieces of metal to the eyes. The bottom of the cups were cut out and lined with paper. Slaked, watered-down lime was poured into the cups, soaking through the paper and eating through the eyeballs. Sometimes the cups were heated red-hot to burn the eyelids off or sear them shut. Being blinded could be a lifelong torture in itself. In a time before Braille or any kind of aid for the handicapped, the blind were forced to beg for food on the streets. Blindness could be a fate worse than death. Tucker telephone. Before Winthrop Rockefeller became governor of Arkansas in 1966 and instituted prison reform, the Arkansas prison was a dangerous place for inmates. It was legal to whip prisoners in Arkansas, but they were regularly beaten and tortured by guards who shot at them for fun. There were stories of prison trustees who put needles under inmates' fingernails and attacked them with pliers. The prison most notoriously known for the sadistic treatment of prisoners was Tucker Prison. This is where Dr. A.E. Rollins developed the Tucker telephone. The Tucker telephone was constructed from parts of a crank telephone. The electric generator inside the phone was wired to 2 batteries. The victim was taken to the prison hospital and strapped to a bed. One wire was attached to his big toe and another to his genitals. When the crank was turned, an electrical shock was administered to the prisoner. Trustees, inmates that earned guard-like privileges, would administer long-distance calls to those they felt needed extra punishment. A long-distance call was a series of shocks administered in a row until the victim was on the verge of passing out. Shocks from the Tucker telephone could cause PTSD and permanent organ damage. The last known use of the Tucker telephone in the Arkansas prison system was in 1968. That same year, the superintendent of the prison was sentenced to 1 year in prison and a $1,000 fine for violating the Civil Rights Act of 1871 in regard to his treatment of the prisoners. The judge eventually suspended his sentence, giving him probation instead, saying that he feared the superintendent would be killed in prison. It is believed that a similar device was rigged from field telephones during the Vietnam War to torture captured Viet Cong. It was also rumored to have been used by cops in Chicago in the 1980s and at Abu Ghraib prison on Iraqi prisoners. Rat torture. In Elizabethan England, if you needed to torture a man, there was a cheap and easy method available. The Tower of London was right there. Just let the Toms River flow into a window and create something called the Rat Room. Rats were washed into the room, and when the water went down, the rats were stuck in there. Drop a prisoner in, and let the rats rip the skin off his bones. If the torturer wanted to watch, he could strap a clay bowl to the stomach of the victim. Rats were placed under the bowl. A rat against his bare skin was enough to raise the blood pressure of the prisoner, but that wasn't enough. The executioner would heat up the bottom of the bowl. The rat would attempt to escape the heat by scratching and gnawing through the skin and into the body of the condemned. Another form of rat torture was called the rectoscope. A tube was inserted into the rectum or other orifice of the victim, and the rat was led down the tube. It would eat its way to the surface to escape the darkness. Rat torture was said to have been used during the Spanish Inquisition and during the Dutch Revolution. Writings suggest that Nero threw criminals into a barrel full of rats. In India, special pants were made that were tight around the ankles and loose around the groin. Rats were poured into the pants and forced to eat their way out. More recently, the dictator Augusto Pinochet punished political prisoners with rat torture. Scaphism. Also known as the boats, scaphism is a form of torturous execution. The most famous account of scaphism is the story of Mithridates. In 401 BC, Mithridates, a Persian soldier, killed Cyrus the Younger. The king was pleased by this because Cyrus had claim to the throne. Mithridates had killed a threat to the king, and was told he would not be punished for the murder if he allowed everyone to believe the king had killed Cyrus. Mithridates couldn't keep his full mouth shut and boasted at a party that he was, in fact, the murderer of Cyrus. The king sentenced him to the boats. 2 boats were made to fit into each other, creating a cocoon-like structure when put together, and Mithridates' body so that just his head, arms, and feet were left protruding from the structure. Mithridates was force-fed milk and honey, which caused explosive diarrhea inside his tomb. When Mithridates was so full that he vomited, the milk and honey mixture was poured over his extruding limbs, particularly his face. He was then left, face up, in the sun for flies, bees, and other bugs to land on his exposed body parts. Meanwhile, rats and other small creatures burrowed into the boats and feasted on his excrement-covered body. Once the condemned was dead, the top boat was removed and maggots were seen feasting on his corpse. Mithridates survived this torture for 17 days. This form of punishment was reserved for what was considered the worst crimes: murder and treason. Victims could be kept alive longer by continuing to feed them so they wouldn't starve. Often, the cause of death would be exposure and sepsis or gangrene from infection in the open wounds. So there you have it. 5 of the most brutal torture methods. I'll be continuing this series where I just talk about disturbing things into perpetuity, I guess. Anyway, let me know what you thought in the comments and try to have a good day and don't get tortured to death. Thank you.